this is a study in obsession. There is perhaps no work of fiction that has moved me as much as Kanon. To me, it's a game with a unique kind of poetic beauty and some really heartfelt characterization. Kanon is the first piece of media that I meticulously picked apart, where I made notes about all the connections, symbolism, and foreshadowing I kept discovering, and I've been really looking forward to finally being able to put all that into words. At its core, Kanon is built on a series of apparent contradictions. It's a story of someone who finds a warm home in the middle of a frigid winter. It's a story about a town where time has stood still, yet also one where everyone struggles against the inevitable passage of time. It's a story about people who chose to forget about the past, even though they're still haunted by their memories. It's a story about gut-wrenching tragedies, yet one filled with miracles that leave behind a sense of hope. And although it's a small, intimate story, it's also one that, in my view, captures nothing less than the totality of life itself. And it's here, in this misty town, eternally covered by a beautiful, deadly blanket of snow, that I met a lone girl. Hello, my name is Sean, and yes, this video was deliberately released on the starting date of Kanon's present-day storyline. So as a quick heads up, this is an analysis of the 1999 visual novel, the debut work of the renowned studio Key. But most of this is equally applicable to the excellent 2006 anime adaptation by Kyoto Animation. As Key's first game, Kanon lacks the grand scope of their later, genre-defining games like Clannad or Little Busters. Nevertheless, some of the studio's signature qualities are already present in their first work. Just like many other visual novels by Key, Kanon is a work of magical realism, a story dotted with small supernatural occurrences. And it's filled with Key's quirky, lovable heroines whose fates often put our hearts through the ringer. In any case, the first key, and that pun is very much intended, about how to understand Kanon comes from its title. The term canon refers to a type of music in which a given melody is repeated with slight variations throughout the piece. There's perhaps no better metaphor for the compositional technique behind Kanon. This visual novel is comprised of 5 diverging storylines, each focusing on one of its 5 main heroines. And while these routes can be enjoyed on their own, the true magic of Kanon comes from the way each of these stories offers a different angle on the game's overarching themes, images, and ideas. This compositional principle allows the game to be more than the sum of its parts. The more time you spend in Kanon's wintry wonderland, the more you start noticing all the associations, parallels, and contrasts between the different routes. It's also a story where every minor detail and interaction seems to carry deeper significance under the surface and ties in to some of its central ideas. So, in this series of videos, each installment will cover one of Kanon's central themes, starting with discussion about its significance to the game as a whole, followed by a deep dive into one of the storylines in particular. The story of Kanon begins in early January, when Yuuichi Aizawa returns to a snowy town that he had not visited for years. During the second year of high school, his parents had to move abroad for their work, and since Yuuichi wanted to stay in Japan, he looked for relatives to take him in. And so, he ends up moving in with his aunt Akiko Minase and her daughter Nayuki. Yuuichi has an odd relationship with his aunt and cousin. As a child, he often spent the holidays with Akiko and Nayuki, but for some reason, he abruptly stopped visiting them 7 years ago and has not seen them ever since. And more strangely still, Yuuichi barely remembers anything about the time he spent in this town all those years ago. Kanon is fundamentally a story about our relationship with the past, about how we cope with grief and sorrow. And in that light, it's also a story about memory. Memories that are cast aside, memories that are altered and perverted, memories that are preserved, and memories that linger even beyond death itself. The central role of memory in Kanon is emphasized from the game's very first scene. Yuuichi sits alone on a bench in the freezing cold, covered by snow. By this point, he has been waiting for 2 long hours, in a town where he does not remember the way to his aunt's home. So, have the Minases actually forgotten that he's arriving today? At long last, his cousin Nayuki appears, and after a bit of banter, Nayuki asks him a crucial question. Does he still remember her name? Yuuichi immediately returns the question. How about her? Does she still remember his? Nayuki names Yuuichi without hesitation. And then her cousin offers a joking response. He answers with the wrong name. And satisfied with his witticism, Yuuichi is ready to head to his new home. But Nayuki is surprisingly upset by this joke. She keeps insisting on him remembering her name until Yuuichi finally relents. It's actually staggering just how much characterization we get from this small exchange. Yuuichi is the one who has forgotten his past with Nayuki. At the start of the game, her name is pretty much all he actually remembers about her. But he's also a person who keeps his cards close to his chest and pushes others away with humor and sarcasm, rather than allowing himself to get close to others. Nayuki, on the other hand, is the girl who remembers everything, the one who was left behind and deeply afraid of that happening to her again. And that's something I'll return to in the second half of this video. And in the Japanese, all this is underscored by wordplay. The na in Nayuki is written with the kanji character for name. So when Nayuki asks Yuuichi for her name, she is basically giving away the answer for free. And when Yuuichi pretends that he doesn't remember the name that's actually put before him on a silver platter, he is actively rejecting her as soon as they reunite. And as the story of Kanon unfolds, it turns out that Yuuichi is not the only one with peculiar lapses of memory. One day, Yuuichi is unexpectedly confronted by a girl who claims to have a deep-seated hatred for him. But this mysterious assailant collapses almost as soon as she's appeared, and Yuuichi ends up bringing her home with him. When she comes back to her senses, it turns out that she does not remember anything about herself. It even takes her a while to recall her own name. We get the parallel between the Nayuki scene at the beginning, where Yuuichi doesn't seem to remember her name, and this scene where there's a character who actually does not remember her name at all. Eventually, she identifies herself as Makoto Savatari, and since she doesn't know where she came from, she's allowed to stay with the Minase family for the time being. But over the course of her storyline, Yuuichi discovers that Makoto has a startling connection to his past. He learns that this amnesiac girl is not really human, but the incarnation of a fox cub that Yuuichi rescued and cared for during one of his holidays when he stayed with Nayuki and Akiko. But Yuuichi could not be with the fox forever. The holidays eventually ended, and the boy had no choice but to leave the fox behind. The fox, of course, did not understand why this was happening. She was confused, saddened, enraged by her sudden abandonment. And years later, she took on human form to reunite with Yuuichi once more and to sort through the cocktail of conflicting emotion. She wants to take vengeance on the boy who left her behind, yet she also wants to make up for all the lost time that they could have spent together. But in the world of Kanon, these kind of miracles not last. As the days pass, Makoto loses her human faculties one by one. First, she becomes unable to use cutlery. Then, her abilities to reason, remember, and to speak decline at a rapid rate. And eventually, she succumbs to fever and disappears almost as suddenly as she arrived. In a way, the state of Yuuichi and Makoto's memories move in completely opposite trajectories. Where Yuuichi recovers some of his lost memories during his time with Makoto, Makoto eventually loses almost all her memories from the past few weeks as she declines both physically and mentally. Another girl from Yuichi's past who he's reunited with is Mai Kabasumi. One day, he meets a mysterious girl with a sword in hand in his school by night. Mai proclaims that she's here to hunt demons. A bizarre claim maybe, but Yuichi soon finds out that Mai's invisible demons are very much real and out for blood. In her route, Yuichi assists her in her efforts to eradicate these supernatural threats. But once the two of them have almost finished the job, Yuichi unlocks a series of memories from a summer 10 years ago, and finally, he realizes the truth behind what they have been fighting all along. During another holiday he spent with the Minase family, Yuichi met Mai in a field of wheat and became her friend. On the last day of his stay, he got a frantic call from Mai. She claimed that demons were coming to destroy the field where they always played. In reality, that field would make place for a new building, the very school that Yuichi and Mai are now attending. But over time, Mai brought those demons, the demons that she invented to keep Yuichi from leaving, all the way to life. Her memories became warped, and the boundaries between truth and lies were blurred. In the Mai route, it becomes apparent that one's memories are not as static as we believe them to be, but highly malleable through the course of time. And then, in the Ayu route, we learn that Mai was not the only one to manipulate her memories. In the game's most important storyline, we finally discover the true reason why Yuichi lost his memories from the time he had spent in this town and why he never returned for 7 long years. During the first day of the game, Yuichi is also reunited with Ayu Tsukimiya, a girl he had befriended during that fateful winter 7 years ago. Like Yuichi and Makoto, Ayu also suffers from a curious gap in her memory. For much of the game, she is searching for something she's lost. But oddly enough, she's not entirely certain what that lost object might be. But nonetheless, she insists that it's tremendously important and that she must recover it at all costs. And over the course of Ayu's story, Yuichi keeps seeing flashbacks of his time with his childhood friend in his dreams. And as the route progresses, the puzzle pieces that unlock the answers to Kanon's main mysteries slowly start slotting together. During the final day of his winter break 7 years ago, Yuichi met Ayu at their favorite spot, a clearing in the forest. And as she always did, Ayu had climbed up the tallest tree in the vicinity, a tree that offered a beautiful view over the entire town. And all of a sudden, a gust of wind swept through the forest. Ayu's little body fluttered down, like a snowflake descending to the ground. The pure white snow was stained red, the color cast by the setting sun. Yuuichi holds the dying girl, Ayu Tsukimiya, his first love, in his arms. She asks him one last thing, that he will play with her again one day. And even though Ayu can't lift her hand to make a pinky promise like they always did, Yuuichi linked his finger with hers to satisfy her dying wish. But all this was just too much for Yuuichi. The young boy was overwhelmed by grief, and as a result, he broke one of the most important promises he ever made. A few days before the fatal accident, Yuuichi had promised to grant Ayu 3 wishes. For her first wish, Ayu asked that he would not forget about her after he left, even if she would be remembered as nothing more than a strange girl he met in the snow. And it's hard to overstate just how important promises like this are in canon. A promise, after all, is an even more powerful way of remembering someone. Yet, when Yuuichi made his promise to never forget Ayu, he could have never suspected how soon he would break it. In the aftermath of the most devastating event of his life, the sadness and the guilt were simply too much for his fragile, weak heart. He could not confront the harsh reality and soil his beautiful memories with such a traumatic event. And so, he locked them all up. The memories of the time he spent in this town, the memories of his cousin, of the fox cub, of the girl in the wheat field, and of course, of the fragile little Ayu falling to her death. And for 7 years, he stayed away, far away from the place where these memories lingered on and could maybe be dragged up once more. And although this is not explicitly established in the game itself, I also suspect that Yuichi's surprisingly distant, sarcastic persona is a consequence of this trauma as well. He may have been struggling to form genuine, healthy connections with others ever since the moment that the girl who he had grown close with, Ayu, passed away right in front of his eyes. Until the day that he set foot in that town again, and he was reunited with the girl from his repressed memories once more. As we see time and again, memories are so powerful in the world of canon that they can take on physical form. Just like how Makoto's memories of Yuuichi allowed her to become human, and the demons from Mai's memories were brought to life, Ayu returned from the figments of Yuichi's imagination to make good on their promise that they would play together once more. But when Yuuichi was finally forced to abandon the illusions that gave him comfort and confront the reality that Ayu had been dead all this time, the Ayu he had reunited with in the present storyline had also disappeared. After all, the memories of Ayu had now returned to inside of him. And this is where Kanon's musical metaphor really comes together. Once you learn about the tragedy of Ayu, it becomes apparent that all the other storylines are variations on theme to this main melody. Just like in Ayu's route, the story of Makoto is essentially about a person from Yuichi's past who returned to life. And in Mai's route, Yuichi almost repeated what he did after Ayu's death 7 years ago. At the end of that story, Mai realizes that she can bring an end to the demons by piercing her own heart, and thus she kills herself in front of Yuichi, just like Ayu had died before him years ago. And in response to this horrifying event, Yuichi once more retreats into the safe haven of fantasy. This time, he completely shuts himself off from reality by imagining a future of him living together with Mai and her friend Sayuri, all to escape from his grief over Mai's death. But this time, he's brought back to reality once more by the last remnant of the power that Mai had used to bring the demons to life, her hope. We see a similar variation on theme in the Shiori route as well. In a way, the story of Shiori Misaka seems to be more loosely connected to Kanon's overall project. After all, Shiori is the only one of Kanon's 5 heroines who has no connection to Yuichi's past. Yuichi meets Shiori after stumbling upon Ayu for the second time in town, after which they run into this shy, pale-looking girl. To his surprise, Yuichi comes across Shiori again the next day, sitting outside in the courtyard of his school. And as he starts spending time with Shiori, he learns that this girl is a sister of his classmate and Nayuki's best friend, Kaori Misaka. But when Yuichi one day asks Kaori about Shiori, Kaori flat out states that she has no sister. And this confuses Yuichi initially, but after a week, Kaori finally reveals the truth about the girl Yuichi has been meeting in that frosty courtyard. Shiori has been diagnosed with an incurable illness and might not live until the end of the month. And it's here, during their meeting in the moonlight, that the dam holding back all the emotions that Kaori had been repressing for so long finally bursts. Kaori was confronted by the reality that her little sister was growing weaker and weaker by the day, and eventually she could no longer bear the situation. She became unable to treat Shiori like a normal girl, with the knowledge that she would soon lose her only sister. And so, Kaori decided that the best way to cope with her grief was to ignore reality, to pretend that she never had a sister in the first place. After all, if Shiori had never existed, Kaori would not have needed to suffer the way she does now. And what's striking about Kaori's role in the Shiori route is that the way she deals with her seemingly insurmountable grief sets her up as a mirror image to Yuichi. Kaori tries to seal away the memory of Shiori, just like how Yuichi had more successfully sealed away all his memories of Ayu and the time he spent in the town where he met her. And for that reason, it's here that Yuichi gets a redemption of sorts. After learning the truth from Kaori, we get Yuichi's nighttime meeting with Shiori by a park fountain, one of the most beautiful scenes in the entire visual novel. Now that Shiori's carefully guarded secret is out of the bag, Yuichi too has a choice to make. He can still back away from the sadness that will inevitably come if he continues to associate with Shiori. He could make the same choice as Kaori, the same choice he made after the death of Ayu. And Shiori raises the stakes even further. She asks him to promise that he will treat her like a normal girl, as if they would be together forever. The very thing that Kaori could not do. And this time, Yuichi resolves to see things through to the bitter end. He will be there for Shiori as long as he can and make sure that she will not face her fate alone. And eventually, his efforts even inspire Kaori to acknowledge her sister at long last. But of all the routes in Kanon, it's Nayuki's story that offers the most complicated perspective on a theme of memory. Nayuki occupies a very peculiar position in the game's overall narrative. Ayu is very clearly the main girl, both in terms of her position at the center of Kanon's entire story and in the way she's presented by promotional and subsidiary material. But strangely enough, if you look at the amount of actual in-game dialogue and appearances in the entire visual novel, Ayu is not the most prominently featured character in Kanon. This prize, instead, goes to Nayuki. Nayuki is the first character Yuichi meets in the game. She's the one who integrates Yuichi into his new home and school. She's even the only one of the main heroines who plays a significant role in all the other routes. In fact, Nayuki is often the one who has Yuichi's back during his lowest points. In the finale of the Ayu route, she repairs the lost doll, the mysterious object that Ayu had forgotten and was looking for all this time. And in the Shiori route, she cheers Yuichi up after Shiori initially rejected him, and she procures a pair of bunny ears that Yuichi gives to Mai in the finale of that route. Nayuki has a more prominent role still in Makoto's route, where she helps to fulfill many of Makoto's last wishes. But despite all this, most storylines require you to reject Nayuki in small ways, like declining her offers to eat lunch or walk home together. It's as if the game is actually reminding you that you are forgetting about Nayuki, even though she is around for its entire duration. And what's also striking about Nayuki is how often she expresses her hope that Yuichi will recover his memories. As we saw earlier, the first scene of Kanon revolves around her trying to find out if Yuichi still remembers her name. And Yuichi, in contrast, tries to avoid tapping into any memories that might bring up Ayu. Similarly, the next day, Nayuki asks him if he still remembers the neighborhoods. And although Yuichi can't remember any of it, Nayuki is convinced that it will come back to him eventually. Yuichi, however, the boy who pushes away his memories, responds by stating that he would not really mind if he never did. And that's a view that Nayuki finds rather sad. And Nayuki just keeps pestering Yuichi about his memories throughout the entire game. In her view, if there's just one person who wants to be remembered, Yuichi should try to do so. And over the course of her storyline, it becomes apparent why she is so invested in Yuichi's memories. Where Yuichi has chosen to forget, Nayuki is the one who remembers the events from 7 years ago as if they were yesterday. And this is closely tied to the fact that Nayuki is a girl who is constantly forgotten, left behind, rejected. This idea is already prominently exemplified during the game's first day. When Nayuki and Yuichi head to the shopping center, Yuichi decides to wait outside while Nayuki visits the supermarket. But right after Nayuki leaves, Yuichi is reunited with Ayu and ends up running off with her. And when, at long last, he returns to the shop, he finds Nayuki waiting for him, alone, in the cold, and her only response is calling Yuichi a liar. And as we soon learn, this exact scene took place 7 years ago as well. Back then, Yuichi even promised to wait for Nayuki. And soon after, he met Ayu for the first time, left with her, and broke his promise to Nayuki. We've already seen just how incredibly important promises are in this magical, wintry world. In Kanon, a promise has enough power to bring even the dead back to life. But here, we're shown history repeating itself. In both the past and the present, Yuichi has no qualms about breaking his promises to Nayuki. And this happens throughout the game, that Yuuichi breaks promises time and again. He forgets to wait for her in the classroom, to meet her for lunch, to return her notebook, etc. More poignantly still, when Yuuichi tells her that she shouldn't have waited for him, Nayuki bitterly comments that Yuuichi might break promises, but she would never do so. And all this comes to a head in Nayuki's storyline, when we finally discover the reasons for her complex about Yuichi's amnesia and the emphasis she places on broken promises. But before I get into all that, I do need to address the elephant in the room with the Nayuki route. That this is a storyline that depicts romance between cousins. In the visual novel, Yuichi and Nayuki eventually become a couple, and depending on which version of the game you play, it even contains an adult scene. Now, it's important to note that cousin marriage is legal in Japan, and for that matter, in all but 5 countries on Earth. But nevertheless, of course, sexual relationships between close family members are deeply taboo in most Western cultures. To be honest, I'm not familiar enough with Japanese culture to know much about the attitudes towards this over there. And also, I think it's not really my place to judge a different culture on this front either way. But that being said, it's entirely fair if you don't find the way Kanon treats the topic particularly tasteful. You can't get around the fact that the game never really questions or problematizes its cousin romance. And this is not helped either by its status as a bishoujo game. That's to say, part of a genre that caters to male wish fulfillment fantasies. So, if you don't like what the Nayuki route, or Kanon as a whole for that matter, is doing, yep, that's cool, and I still really appreciate that you're watching nonetheless. In any case, as the route unfolds, we find out that the tragedy of Nayuki boils down to her having been at the wrong place at the wrong time. As a child, she had fallen in love with Yuichi and decided to confess her feelings on a day he left during that final winter holiday. But little did she know that she could not have picked a worse moment. Yuichi had, after all, just experienced the death of Ayu firsthand, and he was in a state of total shock. Nayuki made him a snow rabbit as a parting gift, and this rabbit he violently knocked to the ground. With this gesture, he shattered not just her gift, but more symbolically, her heart as well. The young Nayuki was distraught by this unexpected response. She interpreted it as a complete and utter rejection, and concluded that she must have done something wrong here. But of course, this was just simply not the case. Yuichi was only taking out his grief on his cousin. But despite all this, Nayuki kept up a brave front. She begged him to come back, to say goodbye to her before he would leave. She would keep waiting for him at the bench in front of the station. But all this was in vain. For 7 years she waited, as the snow dissolved and the winter gave way to spring, where the streets were showered with cherry blossom petals. During summer, when the city was filled with the sound of cicadas. During autumn, when she was surrounded by the falling leaves. And when the winter that she loved so much returned, and her town was once more covered by a blanket of snow. All this time, she kept waiting, kept remembering, even though she had long been forgotten. So while Yuichi had forgotten and moved on, even though it becomes clear if you scratch a bit deeper that the wounds had never healed, Nayuki dealt with her grief in the exact opposite way. For her, time had stood still all these years, as she was unable to process her rejection and move on. This idea is underscored by the prominence of clocks in Nayuki's storyline. One of Nayuki's most distinguishing characteristics is the bizarre amount of time she spends sleeping. She goes to bed much earlier than anyone else in the family, and in the morning it's virtually impossible to wake her up. Nayuki has also accumulated an entire fleet of alarm clocks, and yet even their deafening cacophony fails to rouse her out of her sleep. But all this changes after Yuuichi eventually confesses his love to her. To his shock, Nayuki suddenly starts waking up before him day after day. To take a page from all the wintry metaphors in Kanon, you might say that all this time, Nayuki has figuratively been hibernating. The 7 years that she was still shackled to the past are depicted as a long sleep. A sleep from which she only awakens when she is freed from the burden of her promise to keep waiting for Yuuichi, and her life finally starts moving forward again. The significance of clocks is made even more explicit around the middle of the game. One morning, Nayuki's watch suddenly stops. This moment prompts the first major event of the Nayuki route. You can choose to go into town with her to get the watch repaired. So in other words, the moment where the player chooses to commit to Nayuki's storyline is incredibly symbolic. Fixing Nayuki's watch is the first step to helping Nayuki move forward herself. And afterwards, she expresses her relief that her watch is working again. Her discomfort with the broken watch reflects her own mental state, her awareness that she too is frozen in time. And the idea of Nayuki as the girl who's always forgotten finally comes to a head in the route's finale. Now, I've come across criticism of this part in the visual novel, and I get where this is coming from. Unlike in Kanon's other routes, the climactic death scene comes out of nowhere, and in my opinion, the game could have also done a better job communicating how this scene ties into the overall ideas of the Nayuki routes. So yes, the finale of Nayuki's story is not without flaws, but in my view, this storyline is trying to do something much more interesting than it's generally given credit for. So, after Yuuichi finally remembers the incident that scarred Nayuki all those years ago, it seems like Nayuki can finally start moving forward again. But before long, she is cast back into the deepest pits of despair. One morning, she and Yuuichi are called out of class. Akiko, Nayuki's mother and Yuichi's aunt, has been hit by a speeding car and is now hospitalized in a critical condition. All this happened right after Akiko left the bakery, where she had bought the cake that Nayuki had requested that morning. On the site of the accident, the two find a smashed box of strawberry shortcake still on the pavement, amidst red blotches of blood. Significantly, the image of white and red cake, and the red blood as well, recalls two pivotal scenes elsewhere in the game. In Kanon, white and red are highly symbolic colors that feature prominently throughout the entire game. The reason for this becomes clear at the end of the Ayu route, when we finally witness the harrowing event that lies at the center of everything. Red on white is the hue of death, the color of Ayu's blood staining the bright snow. So, by repeating this color pattern, Akiko's accident is presented as a parallel to that of Ayu, the tragedy that completely broke Yuuichi, that made him unable to face reality from that point onwards. But more explicitly, the game parallels Akiko's supposed death to the moment where Yuuichi lashed out at Nayuki in the aftermath of Ayu's death. The cake is smashed up just like the snow bunny that Yuuichi had smashed up 7 years ago. And that parting gift, too, consisted of 2 red beads for eyes inserted into pure white snow. So just when Nayuki had been able to crawl back from the rejection that had haunted her all these years, she is plunged into the depths of despair for a second time. And we see just how impactful this is by the atmosphere after Akiko is hospitalized. Throughout the game, the Minase household is always a place of warmth. And I really love this about the game, all the small ways in which Kanon manages to subtly capture the closeness between mother and daughter. And to see how empty the house becomes when Akiko is ripped away is nothing short from devastating. And it's not just Akiko who disappears either. For 2 days, Nayuki locks herself up in her room. And when Yuuichi finally gets to see her again, it looks like she's melting into the darkness that embraces her. All this brings to mind her fate during the past 7 years. Nayuki is the girl who has always been forgotten, who has always been waiting in the background. And when she reaches the lowest point of her life, she takes her role to an even greater extreme. Nayuki responds to her grief by trying to disappear from sight completely. And it's at this point that it becomes clear that Nayuki's obsession with being remembered comes from something more deep-seated than just Yuichi's rejection. All her life, Nayuki has been raised by a single parent. She says that she doesn't even remember what her father looked like. This is actually the only moment where Kanon addresses a lingering question that many players might have wondered about for the entire game. What actually happened to Nayuki's father? Did this man leave his wife and daughter behind, or did he pass away? Either way, it seems that ever since Nayuki lost her father, she has been facing serious abandonment issues. What Yuuichi did to her merely exacerbated wounds that Nayuki was already carrying under the surface. And this is also illustrated by a question she asks Yuuichi on the morning before the accident. She asks him if he won't disappear on her again. As we soon find out, this is a reflection of her deepest fear. A fear that will become reality all too soon. Within the span of a few hours, she has lost the one person who was always by her side, the one person who never forgot about her. Now, she's all alone. After losing her mother, she will never laugh again. Nayuki's lot is perhaps the cruelest irony in the entire game. Kanon can, quite bluntly, be described as a story about cute girls who suffer tragic deaths. That's the case for Ayu, for Makoto, Shiori, Mai, Sayuri, Akiko, for everyone but Nayuki. So on a meta level, it's as if even the game itself forgot about her. And all this makes the climax of the route so impactful, so meaningful. This time, Yuuichi proves that he will not forget about Nayuki. On the 3rd day after Akiko's accident, he tells her that he will wait for her at the promised place from 7 years ago, the bench outside of the station. The place where Nayuki had waited for him in vain all those years, but also the place where he was reunited with Nayuki at the beginning of the present-day storyline. And after Yuuichi waits at that spot all day, Nayuki finally appears. As she said earlier, Yuuichi might break promises, but Nayuki never does. She will meet him at this bench, even if she might be a tad, or well, also a few hours late. And this time, Yuuichi has changed, grown strong enough to support her in her grief and to face adversity together. This time, he promises that Nayuki can put her faith in him. And that will be a heavy responsibility for Yuuichi going forward. After all, Nayuki is the girl who never forgets. So, Kanon is a story about the different ways people cope with grief and despair, and how everyone is burdened by sorrowful memories, no matter if they're from massive, life-shattering tragedies or from seemingly minor events. And Yuichi's and Nayuki's stories offer us two different dilemmas for facing despair. Can you truly turn your back on things that you might not want to face, especially if that ends up hurting both yourself and those around you? And on the flip side, how long should you hold onto things that are meaningful to you, particularly if they only end up shackling you and holding you back? The strength of the visual novel as a medium is that it allows Yuichi to reach different answers and find different ways to grow and atone over the course of its 5 paths. This way, the game never purports to offer a single answer to something that humanity has struggled with for millennia. And if you're still here, thank you so much for listening through all of this. I hope that I've been able to give you some picture of the tragic beauty of Kanon and why it means so much to me. In 2 weeks, I'll be continuing my exploration of this game. In particular, I'll be delving deeper into its ideas about life and death, the other major theme at the heart of Kanon. So, if you liked what you saw here, please do consider subscribing to ensure that you get alerted to next videos. I look forward to seeing you again soon.